Indian lawmakers will debate a new bill on exam reforms today, which could see tougher penalties in cases of paper leaks.
And it's the latest in a series of steps by the government to address the scandal that has triggered weeks-long protests across the country and forced the country's education minister to resign. This new bill raises jail terms for the accused to a maximum of 10 years from 5 years and increases fines fivefold. For organised examination fraud, it prescribes a minimum 7-year jail term and a fine of up to roughly $1 million. The government says it's putting in place a new task force on examination reforms.
और जल्द से जल्द आने वाली परीक्षाओं की विश्वसनीयता को सुनिश्चित करने का काम इसके रिपोर्ट के आधार पर कर दिया जाए.
I rise to move for leave to introduce the public.
Yesterday's parliamentary session was marred by disruptions. The opposition has been demanding an apology over a police crackdown during last week's cockroach protest march, when officers used batons and tear gas to disperse protesters in New Delhi. They want the country's Home Minister Amit Shah to respond to allegations that police use excessive force.
Our demand is very clear. Where is the Home Minister? Where is he hiding? This has to be answered. He has to come and to the Lok Sabha and he has to explain who ordered for this AK-47 in Bihar, who ordered penalties in Delhi. He has to answer. Why he is not answering?
Prerna Singh is Mahatma Gandhi Associate Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Brown University. Professor Singh, good to see you today. I want to start by asking you to keep us updated, if you can. Protesters, some of them saying the government hasn't released students and supporters who were detained during the protests, which we know is a key demand of the CJP. Would you put this down to chain of command, issues and I guess administrative issues, or are you seeing signs that the government is backtracking now that the demonstrators have dispersed?
Yeah, thank you for having me. It is, so just to kind of, again, remind our viewers that this is a fairly historic and in the last many years, quite unprecedented time in India. This is the single most important in many ways resistance and challenge that the ruling party has faced. As you know, for weeks now, this movement has been gaining momentum, and the negotiation and eventually the resignation of the education minister was a pivotal point. Of course, the key demand, along, of course, with compensation for the victims of the suicides because of the exam leaks that have been tragic and repeated in India. And so so the negotiation, the resignation of the education minister, and the bill that you just described, which puts in place much harsher monetary penalties as well as prison terms for those accused of masterminding or being part of these exam leaks. We're all in very new territory in terms of the government really responding to demands by civil society, particularly by a youth Gen Z-led movement. As you point out, but really the devil is in the details and in terms of what happens now. As you have rightly mentioned, the education minister has resigned, and yet the key demands of the Cockroach Janata Party, the movement, which included, of course, holding the police accountable for this use of force, as well, of course, as the addressal of these exam leaks. That first part of it, the putting in place of the bill, is in place. But again, to remind you, there was a bill that was put in place in Parliament in 2024 in response to similar leaks. And a lot of the provisions of that original bill in 2024 remained unimplemented, and in some ways, many would argue, laid the basis did not put in place harsh enough penalties and did not really restructure the system such that we are in this position again. So there's a lot of hope, but this hope is definitely tempered by the reality of the fact that we do not quite know where we are going to go from here. And so on the one hand is the government, the other is the civil society movement, that even though the youth have left the streets at Jantar Mantar in Delhi, they have said that the movement is not over. They're kind of strategizing, trying to figure out a way of what their next step forward is. And the opposition parties have also gotten involved, as you just saw from the clip. And so I do think there are mechanisms in place now, definitely more than we have seen in recent years, for the government to be held accountable. However, exactly what that accountability will look like and how the government will respond is still very much an open question.
And some of the kids saying that this is really still just the beginning. So they're waiting to see if detained protesters can be released and if the cases against them can be withdrawn. Professor, how could that shape the way future protest movements judge the risks and rewards of confronting the Modi government if they do get everything that they want happen to them?
I think that is exactly the challenge that you have put your finger on. On the one hand, the government has reached an agreement with the cockroach movement that has allowed them to mostly now peacefully dispel this movement. There was a use of force on the 20th of July, and there are continued instances of police brutality. But at the end, the protesters did voluntarily leave the protest site, cleaned it up, left peacefully, left in a jubilant mood, having reached an agreement with the government. However, the question of how they will respond if their key demands are not accepted remains to be seen, in most part because I think the government is not used to being in this position. And I think that is critical. On the one hand, in a long historical arc of India, such student movements are by no means new. Student movements in the 1970s, India has a long and storied history of student movements, of youth movements, of protest, of civil society, for a variety of causes, including, of course, the preservation of democracy. So just to remind our viewers, again, in the 1970s, against the ruling Congress government at that point under Indira Gandhi, there were huge student-led movements that eventually snowballed into such a huge resistance that led to the imposition of the emergency, which was India's 2-year period in which democracy was suspended. After elections were called again, Indira Gandhi was removed from power in large part because of these historic student movements. And so the precedent, the historical example is real and present for these student movements, both for the protesters as well as for the government itself. And so I do think that there could be real costs for not acting on this.
I hear you, Professor. You did call this particular protest unprecedented, and something else that appears to be unprecedented is a legal battle unfolding over the use of AI and facial recognition by Delhi police during the protests. So does the state willing to deploy this kind of technology and methods against its own students and citizens perhaps change how citizens see their relationship with the state as well?
Absolutely. So again, to remind you, the last protest of not quite this magnitude that happened in India was just before COVID, the Shaheen Bagh protests in response to the Citizenship Amendment Act. So it would be inaccurate to say that there haven't been mass mobilizations against the present regime, but I think you're right, both in the magnitude of the protests as well as in some ways the response by the Delhi police and the state at large, the use of force, the use of surveillance. These are open and new questions. I do think that the cockroach movement has shown its willingness to use not just the streets, but also the courts. Their spokesman has said very clearly that they will be fighting for the release of every single protester. So on the one hand, we have the use of technology on both sides. On the one hand, we have the use of these, again, new and unexpected surveillance technologies by Delhi police. On the other hand, we have Gen Z protesters who are chronically online, who have really been documenting this protest and countering every allegation of the use of force by them and demonstrating through these videos, the use of force on them by the police. And so the technology is being deployed by both parties. The question is now, what stand will the courts take? Again, just to remind you, the term cockroach itself comes from the Chief Justice of India, who, of course, is India's most supreme legal entity. And he was the one who described the youth, the unemployed, as cockroaches. And it was in response to that comment by the Chief Justice of India that this movement mobilized originally as a satire, and then, as we saw, as a very powerful uprising. And so, the courts are definitely there in the background. They have been there from the very beginning of the term cockroach. And so what role the courts play, how they address these allegations, and how they respond to the present moment is, I think, actually perhaps the most interesting thing to be watching in the next few weeks.
All right. Thank you so much for your insight, Prerna Singh, who's Mahatma Gandhi Associate Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Brown University.